Welcome back. This wasn't exactly the planned subject for this particular class, but it takes precedent as it's something new and fancy. Reconnaissance aircraft are now available in a number of our vessels, and they have some interesting capabilities. Let us begin with what aircraft we have and on what vessels they're present. To start us off, we'll look at the Americans, and first of their recon aircraft is the SOC-1. One of which can be found on New Orleans, and two of them are carried on Raleigh, Trenton, Detroit, Pensacola, Northampton, and Portland. I'll be honest, aircraft aren't exactly my field of expertise, but I'll try my best to describe their performance. The SOC-1 is a bit on the slower side with a cruising speed of roughly 190 km an hour in low-level flight. It turns decently well, as is to be expected of a biplane, but its engine power is certainly on the lower end. I don't recommend picking fights with dedicated fighters. It is armed with a singular light machine gun and carries two small bombs. These are most likely 100-pound bombs, but I'm not entirely sure. It does have a defensive gunner as well though, but don't expect it to save you too often. The second aircraft for the US is the OS2U Kingfisher. Two of these can be found on Cleveland, Brooklyn and Helena. The OS2U should be a familiar aircraft to the pilots among you, and carries an identical armament to the SOC-1. The Kingfisher is quite a bit faster with a cruising speed of roughly 240 km an hour. One odd part is that the OS2U Kingfisher, a very American aircraft, is also found on the British HMS Enterprise, which carries one of these on a catapult. And oddly enough, this aircraft on HMS Enterprise also still has an American livery. To use that oddity as a segue, we go to the other British planes, first of which is the Osprey Mk, one of which can be found on both Kent and Leander. It is similarly armed to the previous aircraft with one offensive and defensive light machine gun. The cruising speed of the Osprey is roughly 230 km an hour in low-level flight. The engine is fairly decent, so it's not too difficult to get up to this speed, and the decent maneuverability is also quite a plus. It doesn't carry any bombs, so trying to assault any ships would be quite a fool's errand. Other than the Osprey, the Brits also carry the Walrus Mk, one of which can be found on York. It has a cruising speed of roughly 210 km an hour, and it's quite a bit more sluggish compared to the Osprey. But it is much more of a bomber to Osprey's fighter. Walrus is thus also armed with two defensive light machine guns and four what seem to be 250-pound bombs. Interestingly, this is also the only scout plane which has regular landing gear, as well as being able to land on the water. I'm not sure if they'll ever be of any use, but it's something of note. Next, we'll look at the Germans, which have a bit of a history with their scout plane ever since Graf Spee accidentally and only temporarily got access to its aircraft fairly early on. This plane is of course the Arado 196. It is a rather fast float plane with a cruising speed of roughly 290 km an hour in low-level flight. Its engine is quite powerful, but the maneuverability is not the best. Certainly not bad, but just not the best. The Arado 196 is armed with two light machine guns and two 20mm autocannons, for four offensive guns in total. This is the heaviest offensive armament of any scout plane and should be noted, as the Arado 196 can actually be used as a fighter because of it, though it is outclassed by most dedicated fighters it would commonly see. It does still carry a defensive light machine gun too, just like most other scout aircraft. As for explosive ordnance, we see two 50-kg bombs, a similar loadout to most other scout aircraft and not really suitable for surface combat. The Arado 196 is carried on Karlsruhe, Prinz Eugen, Admiral Hipper, Graf Spee and the new Scharnhorst. Each of these ships carries just one aircraft. Then there is the Russian Navy with their KOR-1. This aircraft has a cruising speed of roughly 235 km an hour. The engine power is pretty good and so is its maneuverability. The KOR-1 is armed with two offensive light machine guns and one defensive light machine gun. These guns have a high rate of fire, so they perform rather well against other aircraft. This aircraft also carries two 50-kg bombs. The KOR-1 is only found on the Kirov class cruisers, so Kirov, Voroshilov and Maxim Gorky. All these ships carry only one of these aircraft. Then we come to the Japanese, and they have quite a few aircraft. The first you'll encounter on their cruisers, and the most common aircraft, is the E-7K2. This aircraft has a cruising speed of around 245 km an hour in low-level flight. Not the fastest, but it has good maneuverability and energy retention characteristics. It only has a single defensive light machine gun as its gun armament, and carries 4 60kg bombs. It is carried on quite a few Japanese cruisers, namely Kako, Kuma, Sendai and Furutaka carry one of these planes, whilst Mikuma carries 2 of these on her catapults. Then we have E-8N2. This aircraft has a low-level cruising speed of around 255 km an hour. Quite a bit faster than the previous craft, however the maneuverability and energy retention is a bit worse, but that can be expected of a smaller aircraft with a weaker engine. E-8N2 is armed with a single offensive and a single defensive light machine gun. This is the only Japanese float plane with an offensive armament, so you could say it's the only fighter they have in this category. Though I can't recommend fighting dedicated fighters with this plane. E-8N2 is also armed with 2 60kg bombs. Whether you ditch them soon after takeoff or not is up to you, but I don't see much potential use out of this payload. E-8N2 is only carried on Suzuya, but she does carry 2 of them. Finally, for the Japanese we have the E-13A1, coming in at a cruising speed of 330 km an hour in low-level flight. This is one of the fastest scout aircraft we have at the moment. With a powerful engine, her energy retention is quite good, and being a Japanese aircraft, her maneuverability is pretty good too. For armament, E-13A1 has 1 defensive light machine gun and 4 60kg bombs. Notably, 2 of these bombs are in a small internal bomb bay. And it is the only scout plane to have one. E-13A1 is carried on Agano, which carries 1 plane on a catapult, and on Magami, which carries 2 on her catapults. Last but not least, we look at the Italian RO-43. This aircraft cruises at around 275 km an hour in low-level flight. The engine power and maneuverability are alright, but nothing too special. It has 2 offensive and 1 defensive light machine gun, so it's an alright fighter among the scout planes. It carries no bombs and is one of only 2 scout planes to do so. It is present on Bartolomeo Colleoni, Trento, Zara and Pola. Interestingly enough, these ships don't have the standard catapult we're used to. Instead, the planes are launched off of the bow of the ship, and are otherwise stored in the hangar. Now, that about covers the scout planes we currently have access to. There are a few things to note though. One is that there are a few ships that don't yet have access to float planes, even though they have the obvious facilities for them. The most obvious of these are the American heavy cruiser Baltimore, the Italian light cruisers Raimondo Montecuccoli and Eugenio di Savoia, and the Japanese heavy cruisers Aoba and Tone, though these last 2 may be due to historical reasons. Some of you may know that some nations, mainly Japan, store more aircraft on their ship than just on the catapults. These are apparently planned to be functional in the future, and if that's the case, then the Magami class will carry a mixed load of aircraft, so that's certainly something to look out for. Then there's the fact that the livery on these aircraft in the air and the aircraft on the catapult don't always match. This is apparently not a mistake, and from what I've heard it's just a top layer of paint getting stripped off when the plane gets launched. Another important thing to know is that these planes are limited in realistic battles to just the ones you have on the catapult. If you lose them, they don't come back. In arcade battles, however, these aircraft do regenerate after a considerable cooldown. Then perhaps the more concerning issue is this. Spawning a scout plane increases the spawn cost of any bomber you wish to spawn that match. This is not just a one-off thing. Every single launched scout plane increases the spawn cost for bombers. So if you're reliant on spawning a bomber in your battle, be careful not to launch a scout plane before spawning said bomber. And lastly, not to forget that when you're in control of the aircraft, no one is in control of the ship, which will just continue to execute the last commands it received. so be sure that your ship is not heading towards disaster when you're planning to have an extended flight. So an important question to ask is, what is the utility of these aircraft? There are 4 possible ones that I have found, though in reality some of them are more viable than others. The first and most obvious one is Reconnaissance. Just launch the aircraft and have an eye in the sky. This can be useful to get a general idea for fleet positions. It can help with identifying enemies, or see if there's a threat lurking around a corner down a narrow channel you're about to enter. The flight pattern of the aircraft when not under your direct control can be helpful or not, depending on how you wish to use it. You see, when you're not in direct control of the aircraft, it just flies in a straight line on whatever its last heading was. Though if it's too low to the ground, or the ocean, it will first try to climb up to a more suitable altitude. It's a bit of a shame that the pilot is unable to fly a holding pattern wherever you last left it, though with new technologies like these we can't expect them to be perfect. That's not to say that the aircraft just flying off doesn't have benefits, mainly that you can return to controlling your vessel while the aircraft heads towards the target area, and the switch between aircraft and vessel is pretty smooth, allowing for frequent checkups. The second utility they have is contesting and capturing strategic zones, probably one of the most common uses for the scout plane you'll see in battle. And a very valuable one at that. It gives cruisers a certain upper hand in later stages of the game, when enemy numbers have dwindled and capture point defenses have lessened. Or you can risk it in the opening stages of a battle, when no one is really in position yet. Though I recommend using the faster scout aircraft for this. There are 2 things I want to note that relate to this utility too. One is when you are landed and switch back to your vessel, your plane will stay where it is. However, when you return to this aircraft, the engine will be throttled up, so be careful that this doesn't put you in a tight spot. And another related feature is that when you are not in direct control of the aircraft, it cannot contest capture points. This can be used to your advantage. A friend of mine managed to sneak an aircraft onto a capture zone in a domination battle and beach it without losing it. As soon as he noticed an enemy contesting that particular zone, he'd switch back into that aircraft, denying the enemy that capture point. On Conquest, however, you can make yourself count for 2, as no matter what, your ship will still contest zones, whether you're at the helm or not. So if you also land your aircraft in said Conquest zone, your team will gain another participant to the capturing of that zone. So this is certainly a utility that's going to be refined as time goes on. The third utility has to do with the smokescreen these aircraft can set. I personally haven't experimented with this possible utility too much in actual battle, but I've gotten a general gist of how you could use it. Every scout plane can deploy 3 charges of this smokescreen. It can be deployed over a fairly large distance depending on your speed, as the time it takes to deploy the smokescreen is roughly a quarter of the cooldown period. I know that that's a bit of an odd time measurement, but I believe it will be the easiest for you to keep track of. This smokescreen starts dissipating when roughly 1/3 of this cooldown has passed, and is completely dissipated shortly after 2/3 of this cooldown has passed. So it's not the longest lasting smokescreen, be aware of this. Another important trait that should be known is that the altitude where you can set this smokescreen at is limited to a ceiling of 50 meters. And the moment you cross the ceiling, your current smokescreen deployment stops short. So be very aware of this ceiling, as it also plays another major role. The height at which the scout plane flies determines the height of the smokescreen. Quite literally, the height at which you're flying is the top of the set smokescreen. So if you change altitude frequently, you'll have a very odd looking smokescreen. From personal experimenting, I suggest flying at a height of 47 or 48 meters. That leaves you some buffer space in case your aircraft starts gaining altitude for some reason. I must also note that the height of the set smokescreen has no effect on the duration of said smokescreen, so I recommend always making the tallest possible smokescreen so it can cover your ship. Now, how do you use this smokescreen? There are several options. You could just cover your plane when capping a zone. You could block enemy sightlines by either smoking your own fleet, or by flying a bit closer to the enemy and laying a smokescreen between you and the enemy fleet. This second option being a more effective way to cover sightlines, but tricky to position correctly. But when you smoke close to your mothership, be sure to not lay the smoke too early, as again they have a short duration. Now, the final utility, but most likely the least useful one, attacking air or naval targets. I generally don't recommend you attempt to strike an enemy surface combatant. First off, most scout aircraft just don't carry the ordnance to do meaningful damage. And second, a scout aircraft is a large target for any anti-aircraft gunners, be they blue water or coastal vessels. You may certainly try at your own will, I won't stop you, but don't be surprised at the abrupt loss of your aircraft. The other function, intercepting aircraft, whilst theoretically possible, the armament and flight characteristics of the scout aircraft is just not good enough to keep up with the dedicated strikers or fighters you'll find at the BRs of your mothership. So, experiment, but don't be surprised when you just cannot successfully intercept enemy aircraft. I think that's really all I have to cover on this subject. Any questions?
Does the introduction of scout aircraft mean we're one step closer to aircraft carriers?
That's a valid but loaded question, and a question I've heard before. In my opinion, and I can't stress opinion enough, yes, it is most certainly a technology that can somewhat be translated into a similar technology being used on carriers. However, carriers are a whole can of worms that truly deserve their own lecture. And while mechanically launching a single scout plane may get your hopes up, carrier aircraft operations are a whole separate beast. That, again, should really deserve their own lecture. But in short, yes, I believe that this could be considered another step in a 1,000-mile journey we don't know if it'll ever be completed. But be assured, whatever the higher-ups will decide for us, I plan to keep up with it. Anything else? No? Well, if you think of anything else, you know how to contact me. You're all dismissed.